I'm super excited to be speaking with Dr. Bonnie Comfort, who is an extraordinary author. And sometimes I wasn't sure when reading your book, The Hard Part is Staying Married, whether I was reading this profound contemplative memoir or some smutty, kind of sophisticated erotica. It is just such an incredible, profound, lyrical book. And that is why we are talking today. Anything you want to say or add to that introduction, Bonnie?
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I've never thought of it as a smutty book. I felt like I really had to unzip my chest and show my beating heart about what happened, the details of what happened sexually in my marriage, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense why I was so upset a lot of the time when I was so madly in love with my husband and so happy with him in other ways.
One of the themes in your book, which I should say is a memoir, and it's such a fascinating blend, maybe not while you were living it, but while you've written it, of the insights of an experienced, devoted, successful marital therapist, coupled with sharing your story in a beautiful and heartbreaking marriage. And I think that really sets the context for many themes to talk about. And the one I want to talk about is sexual incompatibility in the context of long-term, committed, loving, frustrating marriage.
Well, it was a very important topic in my household because Bob and I knew right from the beginning of our relationship that we were not a great fit sexually, but we were so crazy about each other that we wanted to make it work. And we found a way to get around our incompatibilities, but things evolved over time in a way that it became a crisis.
So one of the things that you say is sexual incompatibility is so much more than mismatched libido. Will you give in your own words how you would define mismatched libido?
I think that in every marriage, one partner's desire is much higher than the other's because there are other things going on in the person's life that may distract or depress the person, as it happened in my husband's case. And then, women go through so many phases with their bodies, being pregnant, having children, being exhausted from that, not really being, wanting to have sex at that time, and also feeling self-conscious. Both men and women have shame around their sexual needs or longings, but women have a lot of shame about their body shape and size and how they look and comparing themselves all the time to images that we see on the screen constantly. And so I think that affects libido because we have been trained to satisfy the male gaze and not so much live inside of ourselves from our own libido, from our own desires. And a lot of women don't really know what turns them on, what they like and what they really want, which is step one of being able to ask for that from a partner.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really important about your book, Staying Married is the Hardest Part, is that you tell the story of a woman with higher libido, you, than your loving, devoted husband. And in my own practice, I certainly see many women yearning to have more sexual intimacy with their husbands, but in society in general, the cultural meme, the general assumption is that it's the men who want it and the women aren't giving it up. And that makes it extremely confronting for many women because they don't realize that, she's not a freak just because she has a higher sexual desire than her husband or a desire for more frequency in sexual intimacy. And so in your book, you so elegantly describe really being a lady, kind of modest in a certain way, kind of shy, discreet, feminine creature with a much stronger, healthier libido than your husband. Would you say, first of all, if what I've just said was something that ever was an issue for you, you as the woman having the higher drive? And secondly, what is your view about how that plays out in society in general?
Well, I think men imagine they should be the one who initiates. They should be the one who's hotter and who is ready to go more often. And I think the reality is that there's a lot of times when they don't feel like it, or they're worried they can't get an erection and maintain an erection. And that's a huge issue for men. My husband was a very emotionally connected and sensitive person, and he got upset and depressed about things at work, and it just shut him down sexually in that way. There's a lot of men I have known in life who turn to sex for comfort in that way, in a situation like that. Like, let me distract myself from what's going on at the office by having hot sex. It makes them feel better. But that was not my husband. Yeah, I agree with you, but it's so individual. I mean,
So you never had shame, particularly, or whatever word you want to attribute to an uncomfortable feeling about being the high desire partner in your marriage?
no, I did not. Being really hot for each other is a wonderful thing. I didn't feel ashamed of that. No, no. I just, my shame centered around feeling like I had to reach orgasm quickly, or a man would be imposed upon.
Well, just on a personal note for me, I loved your description of your premarital dating life and your early marriage in the 70s. So I wasn't a participant in that era in the same way,
No.
born in 1968, but I lived a life highly influenced and curated by parents who functioned in that era. I really loved kind of reading through your voice what that era was like, because I really only know it through a child's perspective. And I mean, there's all kinds of information about the 70s and 80s available, but your memoir is so kind of personal and poignant that it felt like a treat, really, to view that time through your lens. Okay, so back to sexual incompatibility. And so often people think that it's just mismatched libido, but you say it's a whole lot more than that. Will you speak to that?
I've seen couples where, like, the wife doesn't want the husband to touch certain parts of her body, or she doesn't want to be in certain positions, and men find that frustrating. Or same on the reverse. I've had couples where the husband wants to watch porn and get high, smoke marijuana, and the wife wants emotional intimacy, and she wants much more frequent sex. And so there is that too, in addition to the whole issue of what turns each person on, and how early that comes to be, how early our sexual tastes are shaped.
I mean, early in life, long before we're actually having sex. Will you give an example of how that plays out?
I can speak for myself and my husband, that he was raised in a very restricted religious environment, and kind of felt like he had to steal sex. He had to peek at women, at night, walking by a window, because he could never see a naked woman himself. And he and his friends would find a Playboy magazine, or even the Sears catalog, and find it exciting to look at underwear. And so his tastes were shaped by that era, and his experience of kind of having to steal sex and needing permission to be dirty. And I, on the other hand, was raised in a family where, I wasn't supposed to have sex before marriage, but I got the clear message that whatever went on after marriage was totally fine. So very, very different experiences. And sexual fantasy is fascinating to me, because people's internal sexual fantasy life is unique. It comes unbidden at the time when you're 9, 10, 11, where you're not intending to have that. What excites you becomes a little story in your head, usually. Some people feel shame about that. Other people want to hear it and want to share it and want to do whatever it is that, turns you on more with those fantasies.
Well, do you think, based on how you've laid that out, that if your husband had had therapy or some kind of transformational work, that his sexual tastes would have expanded?
I don't know the answer to that because he was so stuck in that way, and he refused to go to sex therapy with me. I wanted him to, and he would not. But he had fetishes, and fetishes are not really amenable to change. But he could have broadened. He could have, I wanted him to use his voluntary muscles, his hand and his mouth, and he was very resistant to that. And maybe he would have gotten over it if I had.
Yeah, I didn't say replace, but expand. So that makes sense what you're saying. One of the themes in your book that really caught my attention is the relationship between sexual connection and work satisfaction, and specifically in relation to his fetishes, his kind of yearning, his desire, his craving for the fetish experiences that turned him on seem to more or less, in a one-to-one relationship, correlate with how disappointed and depressed he felt about what was going on in his career. Is that, first of all, a fair thing to say?
Oh, yes, but in a very specific way. He wanted to use excitement with me as a way of counteracting his depression about work and getting up his faith to keep going, to keep pitching movie ideas and all of that. So it was not generalized to, well, I'll just look on the street and see somebody. It was focused on me. If I would do what he wanted, it would so turn him on, so excite him. We would have great sex after that. And then he would feel like he could get himself up to, figuratively speaking, to go back out and keep trying. And he would actually verbalize that, it'll help me. If you would do this, it'll excite me. It'll give me motivation to keep going.
It's so interesting because the way that I think this shows up in your book is really that his need to experience his fetish goes up when he's feeling down.
Yeah.
But the way that you're talking about it now, which I see it in the book, but it wasn't as striking to me, is that what he really was doing was using the excitement with you for a purpose, to engage more in his work. And so how do you think about that now? Because even if you weren't being asked to do things that didn't appeal to you at all, even if what was happening was kind of more within your range of what's appealing, it's still really using the sex with you, using you to become enthusiastic about his work, which is even separate from whether or not the fetish is at play. How do you feel about that? How do you think about that in terms of using sex in this way?
In retrospect, I don't like it. I felt that I was being asked to be a kind of a puppet in a play, that it was not in tune deeply with who I was, and him wanting to meet me and be connected in an emotionally intimate way. It was him wanting me to perform for him so that he could get excited and that would help him. I don't like it. And one of the reasons that I wrote this memoir was to process some of these difficult parts of my relationship, because 80% of my relationship was wonderful and I adored him and we had so much fun, such a good time together. But this 20% really sucked. Troublesome enough to me that I thought about leaving him many times. And it's not right to use somebody you love in that way. Perform for me so I can feel better. That is not really about sex. Certainly not about emotional intimacy.
Yeah, it's almost like using sex for masturbation. I mean, the same way that
Yeah.
one would normally use well, I don't want to say normally, there's a whole range, but like it's one thing to self-soothe through masturbation. It's another thing to use your partner to self-soothe through mutual sex.
Yes. Yes. Things changed over time between us because he didn't say those things in the beginning. He always was excited by seeing me in lingerie and taking photographs of me, but it wasn't until he discovered that I had had affairs at his behest, that he kind of turned in a way, and he became much more insistent on wanting to use me in that way, whereas he had not really been that way so much before.
And how do you think about that? I mean, you don't seem to have thought it was payback, but somehow it gave him permission to cross a line he might not have otherwise. How do you think about it?
Yes, it gave him permission to cross a line. It gave him a kind of urgency. And I do think, I mean, if you read all the way to the end of my book, I think, my husband told me to have affairs because I wanted sex more often than he did. And he said, I can't do it. Go out and have it and just don't tell me about it and don't do it with any of my friends. I didn't want to do that. I knew better. I said to him, that's not a solution to our situation. But after years of that, I said, fine, I'll do it. And when years later he asked me, so did you ever do it? And he said, I promise I won't be mad. I told you. I believed him. I believed that he wasn't mad, but he was. And I didn't realize it until after he died. When I thought about it, it was kind of a blinding insight where I realized, of course, he was hurt, profoundly hurt. He was angry. He felt betrayed because there was a change in his tone. He would pressure me to do things, but there was occasionally he'd say something like, well, I don't know why you won't do this for me. It's so easy for you. Or you had your fun. Now, why won't you do this for me? And so those are angry things to say. There was, I think that he was deeply wounded when he discovered what I had done, even though he had told me to do it. So I had to kind of forgive him and forgive myself because I didn't realize how important my own choices were in making him more demanding in that way.
I think that's so profound. And Esther Perel is a great voice for teaching us about how any dynamic in a marriage has something to do with both people. It's not just that when one person has an affair or cheats that they're the quote bad person. I mean, your situation is completely outside that anyway because he encouraged you so many times. But either way, the idea that the person who isn't cheating is contributing to the quality of the marriage in some way. I mean, every situation is different, so I'm not making any broad statements, but I just have a deep admiration for the reflection you've stated, which is like looking at how you can indirectly contributed to this experience that you really didn't enjoy and never would have chosen. But we don't always know how we're contributing to things.
No, I didn't. There was probably some part of me that didn't want to know, didn't want to think of it that way. And so I didn't admit to myself the possibility that he would feel terrible about hearing that news from me, even though he encouraged me, wanted to hear every detail, said it excited him. I think that it didn't occur to me to not believe him when he said, I won't be mad at you. I won't be hurt. And he never said, I won't be hurt. He said, I won't be mad at you. But I think his behavior changed after that. And, the irony is I didn't really sexually enjoy myself very much with these other men I was with. I just liked the attention. I wanted the affirmation. So sad, really.
Yes, and to me, it drives home something that I encounter most often when people are talking to me about opening their marriage, ethical non-monogamy, and thinking so erroneously that when there are challenges in a marriage, opening up the marriage is a way to fix those problems. It only makes them worse. I'm not actually saying that ethical non-monogamy doesn't ever work. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it doesn't work as a solution for a troubled marriage.
I totally agree with you. I don't think it does. I've seen it over and over. To me, it's just the beginning of one foot out the door and then the whole thing collapsed.
Yes. Well, Fani, I really appreciate your sharing your insights, your presence, and the arc of your whole extended intimate life and personally and professionally that gives you so many insights. Is there anything else that you want to make sure to include in this conversation?
Well, I do want to say two things to people who are out there. One is that, and I think particularly for women, have to be more brave in advocating for themselves, identifying what you need, what you won't do, and sticking with it. Because I was like a slot machine. He just kept pulling the handle. Every once in a while I'd pay off, so he just kept pulling the handle. And so I think being brave about asserting yourself is very important. Not abandoning your own things that you won't do where you cross the line. And the other thing is that I think there's so much value in long-term marriage if it is not an abusive marriage, if it is not, cruel in some ways. I think it's important to accept that there's times when you're closer, times when you're farther apart, that it doesn't mean you should walk away. So I want people to be more hopeful about long-term marriage.
Thank you for those 2 points. So important. And I want to hold up my copy of Staying Married is the Hardest Part. I highly recommend if you're interested in more insights and more storytelling with a touch of smut.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I really appreciate your asking me these questions. They're very, I've been very frank with you, and I think there's value in that. So thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you, and totally agree about your being frank.
Yes, and if anybody wants to find the book, they can go to my website. It's bonniecomfort.com.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.